This program is a presentation of University of California Television. Your support makes UCTV's programming possible. Contribute online at uctv.tv/support. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
This time on Subtext, Timothy D. Taylor talks about his new book, The Sounds of Capitalism, Advertising, Music, and the Conquest of Culture.
Hello, my name is Chris Gondak, and today I'll be speaking with Timothy Taylor, Professor of Musicology and Ethnomusicology at UCLA, about his new book, The Sounds of Capitalism, Advertising, Music, and the Conquest of Culture. Tim Taylor, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Let's talk about the earliest days of radio in the 1920s. Who decided how music and which music was going to get on the air?
It's a complicated story in a way because early radio started with hobbyists who would put on a recording or they would play the violin. And then when radio became more commercial by the 20s, you had only one radio station, the National Broadcasting Company. And at the same time, you also had advertisers who were producing a lot of radio shows. And it was a complicated sort of dance that NBC and advertisers did between, figuring out this is the kind of music that we want on the air, this is the kind of music that's going to sell the product that we want to sell, or this is the kind of music that's going to represent our young and not very reputable industry. So there were then and always conflicts about, who is in control and what kind of music is best to put on the air.
That's actually a really interesting way to start the conversation because, here in the 21st century, radio is, everybody knows about radio, but if we go back to the 1920s, it was largely an unproven medium, and I guess it would take, kind of like the person who first ate the oyster, it'd probably take an advertiser to be pretty brave to start putting some of their money off of print and moving it into music and radio. Yeah,
it was a big risk. The main trade journal in the early 20th century was called Printers, Inc., which gives you some idea of what people thought advertising was about. It was a print medium. People talked about billboards and other things. There are some other sorts of advertising, but mainly it was a print medium. And it was really hard for advertisers to figure out what to do with radio, what to do with sound, because they thought that sound was much more intrusive than a print advertisement where you could just, if you didn't like it on the newspaper or the magazine page, you could just turn the page. But having sound come into people's living rooms, selling goods, was thought to be anathema by a lot of people. And the idea of trying to convert notions of print advertising to sound advertising was really complicated. So in the early days, you find lots of people talking about music can be the headline for your advertisement, and there was there was all these analogies made with print to sound because people just didn't know how to conceptualize sound as something that could sell.
Did audiences, actually I guess, did the advertisers have any idea who was actually listening to these shows? I guess conversely, did radio stations have an idea? So if we think today, if I were to go into a company and say, if you advertise on my show, this is the audience that I reach, and these are the people that are buying your products. I imagine that really early on, this was kind of a terra incognita. Nobody really knew who was listening, and conversely, what kind of music they were interested in.
Yep, that's exactly right. There was a lot of consternation about who was listening. We're spending all this money on these musicians and all these engineers, and we don't know what we're getting. Whereas again with print, people knew. We know that the New York Times sells X many tens of thousands of copies in New York City or in this neighborhood or that neighborhood, but with radio, nobody really knew. So very early on in the beginning of radio in the 1920s, there were contests, there were giveaways. Write into us and we'll give you a free recipe or we'll give you a free piece of candy. And people thought that this was a generous thing to do on the part of advertisers, but actually it was a way to try to figure out who was listening and where they were listening. But also it was a way to try to figure out something about the audience. So early letters from fans were analyzed very closely in terms of quality of paper, quality of penmanship, amount of education that you could discern, like was the grammar, good in these writings, was the grammar poor, was spelling good, was spelling poor, all as a way of trying to figure out, who is our audience, and then of course there are lots of polls about listener preferences, what do you want to listen to, polling and a sophisticated way like we currently think of it didn't really exist. And listener polls in particular were very, very crude at the beginning.
I want to talk about one of the acts. We're talking about different acts during this history, but the first one that I really caught my eye from the late 1920s were the Clico Club Eskimos.
Yep.
You got to explain, who were the Clico Club? I got to say this. Clico Club Eskimos, and what was so unique about them?
Clico Club was a ginger ale that I think was manufactured in Massachusetts, if I remember correctly. And they were an early radio sponsor. I think starting in 1927, they had an act called the Clico Club Eskimos. They had a sort of a cherubic Eskimo that was their trademark. And they decided that the best way to promote their brand, their ginger ale, was to hire a band of banjos, because they thought that the plucking sounds of banjos that captured the effervescence of their ginger ale. So they had 4 or 5 banjo players. They had some accompanying instruments too, but mostly it was banjos. And this became an iconic early radio show. Iconic to the extent that it was actually revived in the 50s, and that's how we can hear them today. Nobody was recording their shows back in the 20s because recording was very cumbersome. But the musicians made commercial recordings, so you can hear what the musicians sounded like apart from the radio show. Old scripts are available. So you can see what the script sounded like, and you can see how the advertising copy was worked into the presentation of the musicians and the songs that they're going to play.
And they dressed them up like Eskimos.
Yeah, they had these white costumes that was supposed to represent, what Eskimos, what Inuit people look like. They're all white guys. The leader of the band was a guy named Harry Reeser, who was an unbelievable banjo virtuoso. But this was the idea, that somehow that this music would convey the effervescence of their ginger ale better than anything else.
Now, when we talk about radio and advertising and figuring out how to make money off of it, you mentioned early on that NBC during the early 20s was really the radio network. But William Paley came along, the man who founded the Columbia Broadcasting System, better known as CBS, and he saw it as a different way. What is it that William Paley saw about radio and music and advertising that made him different than David Sarnoff, who was running NBC?
Well, NBC made its money because it was owned by Westinghouse and AT&T and General Electric. So the way that they made profits was to sell radios. And the way to sell radios, they thought, was to get people to want to hear what was broadcast on the radios. But the Columbia Broadcasting System did not own any, did not have any interest in radio parts, or AT&T, which is how in the days before satellites, that's how this radio signal was conveyed, great distances. So Paley's idea was that what you sold was not a program or not radios, but what you sold was audiences, and this was a revolutionary idea. As much as most of us would say we hate commercial broadcasting, at least I do. Paley figured out that if you could sell audiences to advertisers and guarantee advertisers that they would have a particular audience at a particular time in a particular place, then you could actually you could actually fare much better than NBC did, which couldn't make those guarantees. Their system allowed local stations to keep the primetime slots if they wanted and put their own acts on, because primetime was the best slot, even in the 20s and 30s. Paley figured out that if he could entice his affiliate stations to surrender primetime, or to entice them to let CBS have the best slots, then CBS could go back to an advertiser and say, we can guarantee you, Metropolitan New York from Saturday 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And NBC just couldn't do that. This is pretty well known to broadcast historians, but I found some archival evidence that talks about this, about how people in the advertising industry are complaining about, NBC, they don't have their act together yet, unlike CBS, because, they can't guarantee the audience that CBS could do. And now it's fairly common for people who study the advertising industry and broadcasting to talk about the audience as the commodity. But that was a revolutionary idea of Paley. He was really a kind of a business genius in that regard.
How did the Depression affect music? On radio, I guess I should specify.
Well, I actually found something in the NBC archive, which is in Wisconsin, where they actually say no mention should be made on the air of bank failures or the economic downturn. So the radio industry just sort of went happily along. Some major figures in the industry, like Bruce Barton, who was one of the founders of what became known as BBDO, Batten, Burton, of course I can't think of it when I need to think of it. Batten, Burton, Durstein, and Osborne. Sorry, there we go. And he said that the Depression didn't affect them at all. That he writes, we hardly knew there was a Depression. Other people I've read said that the Depression did hurt. What did hurt the broadcasting industry? What really happened is that you saw that the gingerliness with which advertisers treated the audience, the radio audience, kind of disappear. The fears of selling goods in the home pretty much went out the window because they were desperate to sell goods. So pitches got stronger. Musical acts, I don't know if it changed the nature of musical acts, but you did see during the Depression the rise of the radio jingle, which was a massively important sales device in advertising, which was sort of a hard sell pitch, but wrapped in an easy to swallow musical message.
And we're going to talk about jingles when we come back. Stay tuned after the break.
The world needs more impossible, more unconventional, unreasonable, unhinged.
You're tearing me apart!
Keep telling us we're naive, that we should get real, that we don't have a shot. For every barrier, we have a breakthrough. Every obstacle, a leap forward. For every cynic, these inspiring grounds have given us an optimist.
Welcome back to the show. When we went to the break, we were talking about a jingle. I would have thought it absurd before I read your book to even ask this question, but I've learned from this book and some other things that there are people out there who don't know what a jingle is. So can you give me, a quick thumbnail sketch of what a jingle is?
It's a short, happy, snappy, hopefully unforgettable, at least hopefully unforgettable by the people who write them, tune that mentions some attributes of a product and sometimes not much more than that.
Was it controversial when they started? I mean, you also talked about the fact that we went to the Depression, all of a sudden the gloves kind of came off and stuff had to be moved and the jingles were kind of seen as a little bit more of a hard sell.
Yeah, it was, but it wrapped up in often a really, really catchy tune. There was something of a craze for jingles when they first hit the scene. There was something before musical jingles in the 19th century that were just verse, not music. And you could probably trace the history of people singing to sell goods, as far back as you want. The oldest reference I've ever seen goes back to the 14th century in France. Street cries, people just selling goods and walking down the street and, extolling the virtues of the goods that they're selling. But the jingle, as we think of it, has a fairly short history in regional and local markets, but the national jingle really didn't take off in this country until the very late 30s.
Was there a jingle zero nationally where you can say, okay, this was the first song that really kind of started the jingle as far as a national advertising craze?
Yeah, well, there's one for Wheaties in 1926, but it didn't start the craze. The one that really started the craze was in 1939 for Pepsi Cola, where two lyricists and songwriters walked in cold to the office of the president of Pepsi, and they had a portable phonograph under their arm, and they played a jingle that they had written for him, and he bought it on the spot. But in 1939, you couldn't rent airtime in segments less than 30 minutes. And in a 60-second or 30-second jingle, you couldn't do anything with it. So the president of Pepsi found sort of a down-on-its-luck radio station in New Jersey that would actually rent them just a short amount of airtime. And he got the jingle on the air that way, and it became so popular that the networks across the country began to start to air commercials that were short. But this jingle was hugely successful. I mean, it's translated into 55 languages. You could buy sort of popular recordings of it. My book's website will have a recording of sort of a popular version of the jingle. It's called Swinging the Jingle, so it's sort of a swing version from the early 40s. I found a cartoon in Time magazine from the 40s where a couple of obvious Soviet people, there's an onion dome out the window, and these Soviets are listening to the Pepsi Cola jingle on the radio, and the husband says to the wife, I think it's their national anthem. Or national folk song, or something like that. It's very funny. So it was a massively popular jingle that Pepsi used for a very long time, but because the jingle mentioned that the price of their cola was 5 cents, when Pepsi finally raised the price, they got rid of the jingle, of that particular jingle, but they used it for a very long time.
I know there was that crossover here that they had that. When you say the 1940s, the first jingle that pops into my mind was the Chiquita Banana song.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that one?
That was the next big one. The first one for Pepsi, ignited this craze. Everybody wanted to have a jingle because it worked so well for Pepsi. So the next one is for Chiquita Banana, which people today might still remember because Chiquita has used it for years. Their website still has it. And that one was not only catchy, but it conveyed information to Americans not used to buying tropical fruit about about not putting bananas in the refrigerator, which to this day people know. Those lyrics have been changed over the years because everybody learned how not to put bananas in the refrigerator. But that was another phenomenally successful one that got used even longer than the Pepsi one because it didn't mention the price. They did update the lyrics and the sort of the style of that jingle over the years, but they kept the melody, which many people, I would say from the age of 30 and above probably still know.
So we learned from Pepsi that if you're going to have a jingle, make sure that the price isn't listed so you can continue to kind of work through the system.
Yep.
After the war, there ended up being, I can understand from a jingle, apart from the fact that musically it's hitting something subconscious that people want to hear, but also if you're singing something, you're delivering copy. You're telling people the unique selling proposition of your product, why they should buy it, etc. But you talk about in your book that there ended up being kind of, I want to say, a bit of a change in advertising, really where they started to look at it less from selling I don't want to say the qualities of the product as far as like a unique selling proposition, but starting to sell mood and theme. Could you talk a little about where this came from? I thought they would have done this a lot earlier because that's what films did, really, from the start of sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the surprising things that I discovered. And so I wrote a whole chapter about music and mood in advertising because it didn't come in right away, which is very strange because people in film, even before sound film, like silent film with a pianist in the theater, people were worrying about mood because you didn't want to have happy music playing while the heroine gets shot or something. So you had to make sure that the music and what was on the screen matched. But in advertising, it was really all about animating the product, like we talked about with respect to the Clico Club Eskimos. And I've read all the trade press about music and radio, going back to the 20s and some before. And there's only 2 or 3 references to music and mood before World War II, which is really kind of astonishing. So it's very clear that people just assumed that a jingle or music advertising was going to be happy and upbeat, and that was it. And obviously nobody had to say that, but there was no consideration about degrees of happiness or we want joyous as opposed to mere happy. There's nothing like that at all. And when TV comes along after World War II, people in radio, like they didn't know what to do with radio advertising when print was dominant. They didn't really know what to do with TV either. So people in radio simply conceptualized it as television, as radio with pictures. So you didn't find music changing, you didn't find the style of jingles changing any more than they had changed before. But by the late 50s, you finally get people starting to say, hey, why don't we start using the sort of emotional power that music can have to sell product. But not until the very late 1950s, which was really quite surprising. And it came in not through the professional, Hollywood or New York City jingle composers. It came in through classically trained musicians who were used to thinking of music and emotion all along, as were, other musicians too. So people like Mitch Lee, who trained at the Yale School of Music under the German composer Paul Hindemith, Roy Eaton, who's very famous in the industry, but was a classical pianist, and Mitch Miller, who died recently at the age of 98 or something. All of them had classical training, and all of them said, we need to figure out how to use the emotional power of music to sell goods, and that was a new thing in the late 1950s. So you have music and emotion going along with visuals on TV for the first time. The style of music still didn't change that much. It was still sort of tracking what was going on in popular music, but music was being conceptualized as something that could be used to sell product in this different kind of way.
And we'll be back after a short break.
The world needs more impossible, more unconventional, unreasonable, unhinged.
You're tearing me apart!
Keep telling us we're naive, that we should get real, that we don't have a shot. For every barrier, we have a breakthrough. Every obstacle, a leap forward. For every cynic, These inspiring grounds have given us an optimist.
And welcome back. Obviously, popular show out right now is Mad Men, looking at advertising in the 1960s. Let's pretend that we are back then, and we wanted to come up with a jingle. The guys at Sterling Cooper want to do a jingle. Can you talk about what sort of professional infrastructure existed around Madison Avenue during the time of Mad Men if an advertising company wanted a jingle?
Let me first say that the people I interviewed who were in the business then say that Mad Men gets it absolutely right, which is interesting. So. For those of us who are interested in industry, it's good to know that that show has a good representation of what things were like. What they would have done in that era was to engage what was known as a jingle house, a music production company that produced jingles. And in that era, budgets were, I wouldn't say unlimited, but they were pretty much unlimited. So you could actually hire, if you were a composer, you could hire a composer in a jingle house. You could hire a 20-piece, 30-piece orchestra. You could hire big name musicians, singers, instrumentalists, and they would record your jingle, usually fairly quickly. And a campaign in that era would take a while. Today, people will turn around music in sometimes just a day. But in that era, you might take a year to develop, a long-term campaign. So the very famous commercial called Hilltop, which is the one that people know as "I'd like to teach the world to sing," that took about a year to get on the air, from the moment of conception to a year. So you had immense amount of money and immense amount of talent. I mean, many of the greatest musicians in New York City were working in sessions, recording jingles as instrumentalists and as singers. Kenny Burrell, my colleague here at UCLA, who's a great jazz guitarist, did a lot of commercial gigs back in that era, and there'd be a lot of back and forth between Sterling Cooper and the jingle house about, we want this kind of sound, we want that kind of sound. They would be, in that era, they would be starting to talk about affect a little bit, affect or, emotion. Affect is the more technical word we use in music. Probably not a whole lot. I think it would be more sort of by the seat of your pants, like, that sound doesn't match up with the video, or, with the visuals. Today there's a very, clear and complex vocabulary for various moods. I mean, somebody will say, I don't want bittersweet, I want melancholy. I mean, it's on that kind of level. In that era, I don't think they were going that far. It was still sort of like happy, this kind of happy or that kind of happy. But there was a big infrastructure of jingle houses, and there was a big infrastructure of professional musicians who mainly worked in commercial recording studios, especially singers, because by the 60s, you had a singer who was known to have impeccable diction, because advertising agencies wanted to make sure that their copy was pronounced perfectly, and especially the name of the brand was pronounced perfectly. So you had singers who were really, had just unbelievably clear diction, and who could sight read, could just walk into the studio and read something off the top of their heads, because they're getting paid a lot of money, and you don't want to spend 3 days in rehearsal. You want to do it in 1 or 2 takes. So you had a lot of professional jingle singers, more than professional instrumentalists who do different kinds of studio work. But professional jingle singers existed in the 60s.
I want to talk about, you were going through this whole question of professional, and it made me think part of the book where you're talking about, there are a lot of people who are quite famous who were doing jingles back then who don't like talking about it. Barry Manilow being the exception, who has no problem talking about it jingles. But the book ends with today, where the whole idea of, I don't want to sell out to commercials or advertising, it's almost as if it's done a complete 180. And it's in your book ends talking about how the advertising agency in some ways have moved from being selling products to becoming the gatekeepers of culture. So today, if I not necessarily want a jingle, or I wanted to get my music into an advertisement, how would that happen? Who would do it?
Well, there's we have a new infrastructure today. I mean, people's attitudes have changed because of economic necessity, which always changes people's attitudes about things. So in the 50s and 60s, when rock and roll started to edge out the Broadway musical and the old-fashioned songwriter like Hoagie Carmichael, a lot of those guys started writing jingles because that was the way they could get work. So people like Arthur Lesser started a jingle company, or jingle house in the 50s, and employed people like Ogden Nash and Hoagie Carmichael and other people
Yeah, no, I just want to say the fact that Hoagy Carmichael, the man who wrote Stardust, which I think is one of the great pop songs of all time,
Yes.
and ended up writing jingles during the end of his life, is, I don't want to say sad, but definitely an interesting way you wouldn't think that's how Hoagy Carmichael ended up.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how many he wrote in the end, but for them, you know, as you know, the song market, you know, the Tin Pan Alley song market started to dry up. They needed to make a living, and it's no different in our own time. So what happened was in 1996, the Congress passed the Communications Act of 1996, which made it legal for a single corporate entity to own more than one radio station in the same market. So one corporation can own 6 rock stations in Los Angeles if it wants to, or one corporation can own 3 country stations in Atlanta, or 4 hip hop stations in New York City or whatever. And that made it a lot harder for musicians to get on the radio, because what happened is that playlists got streamlined. There's just less different music being played on the air, and musicians' unwillingness to let their music be used for commercial ends dried up fairly quickly. And so now there are music supervisors whose job is to find music out there, to place in commercials, to place in broadcasting, to place in films. And this has become sort of a recent and powerful profession, and they're professional listeners, basically. Some of them have day jobs as DJs, and they're kind of tastemakers whose job is to find those, the music that might sound good at, in the last 3 minutes of Grey's Anatomy or something like that. And there are also agencies whose job is to do that. And record labels and publishing companies have offices now that help place music in commercials, and place music in films, and place music in TV shows.
So is Tin Pan Alley, that was in New York, is it now, can we think of it as Tin Pan Canyon here in Los Angeles? Has there been a locus, I guess, of that advertising power has it moved to Los Angeles simply because there is such an entertainment complex here in this area?
No, there's still a lot in New York, but there's a lot here too. New York was probably historically the capital of commercial music production, but the big New York jingle houses, which they're not really called that anymore, but the big companies there will have an office out here. Some of them are based here, but it still exists in New York. Yeah.
You probably listen to tons of jingles while you're doing this. Is there one jingle in particular that makes you think, you know what, for what they're trying to accomplish musically and emotionally and mood, it's like they really nailed that. That was a really, really good jingle.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great jingle music composers, I would say, but I think for me the best 2 are Barry Manilow, who wrote maybe my favorite jingle of all time.
Not the American Bandstand theme?
No, one for Band-Aid. I am stuck on Band-Aid, Brandon. Band-Aid stuck on me, which I think is unbelievably catchy. He wrote some other famous ones too, but I think that one to me just sticks in my head. And then a man named Steve Carman, who wrote some really famous ones for Budweiser, Salem cigarettes, back when cigarettes could be advertised. You can take Salem out of the country, but you can't take the country out of Salem. And some really, really well-crafted and very, very catchy tunes. So there's some great musicians who wrote jingles over the years, but for me, those 2 are the pinnacle.
So what did you want to accomplish writing this book?
Partly I wanted to tell the untold story, because this is a bunch of music, a body of music that most people know but don't know anything about. And I got intrigued because I wrote an article some years ago about world music and TV commercials, because my first book was about world music, and I remained interested in the whole question of world music. And in the course of writing that article, I interviewed a bunch of musicians, all of whom were happy to talk, because nobody, sort of outside of the world of advertising had talked to them before. And they were eager to talk, and they were really interesting. And then I thought, well, gee, I guess I have a project here. So partly I wanted to tell their story, because nobody really knew it outside of the industry. And partly I've long been interested in American consumer culture, and I wanted to see what role advertising played in that, which has been often written about, but also, more significantly for me, what role music plays in the production of consumption, really, and the changing role that music has played in the 90 years that I look at in this book.
Tim Taylor, professor of ethnomusicology and musicology here at UCLA, and author of The Sounds of Capitalism, Advertising Music and the Conquest of Culture. Thanks so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My name is Chris Gondek. Thanks for watching.